Good afternoon, everybody. The best-selling author Thomas Friedman tells us that we live in an increasingly flat world where the technologies of texting and other 24/7 communication formats make Beijing, Bangalore, and Bethesda next-door neighbors. I happen to think we also live in an increasingly divided world, geographically, culturally, technologically, in terms of wealth and scarce resources, war and peace, education and illiteracy. We seem more often these days to incline to extremes rather than to common ground, let alone to what Dr. Martin Luther King described as a single garment of destiny. Words like compromise and globalization and even diversity are mostly now loaded terms with pejorative meanings. And so last year, we focused our speaker series on civil discourse, the idea that how we communicate in person, in private, and on the internet should at all times be respectful as well as responsive, without compromising our beliefs or the passion behind them. We brought 11 speakers to campus, we sponsored 15 events around the theme, and Mount Aloysius got some national recognition. People appreciated the focus we put on the topic. This year, we came to the same problem, Friedman's flat world and my divided one, from a slightly different angle. In the midst of all that diversity of opinion, the divided world that I refer to, there is really one constant, and that constant is change. Maybe the only constant in your young lives. And the danger in a world that's so driven by change, 24/7 driven, is the sheer pace of that change, and sometimes the sheer nonsense and unfathomability of some of it means we start to lose our place in the world, in our own world, in our haven, our sanctuary, our safe place, our home, as we try to deal with these 24/7 inputs. And that 24/7 pace means that you are bombarded every time you open up your laptop or your iPhone. It means that you get overwhelmed with what our Dean of Faculty, Dr. Fulop, referred to as the look and lifestyles of the Kardashians, to the exclusion of what he called in his convocation remarks, a liberated mind. The 24/7 pace means that in keeping up with all this information, all the political, fashion, and lifestyle exhortations that are directed at you, and at you personally, with the technology that's now available to internet marketeers, the sheer effort of keeping up can cause you to lose your own place in the world, in your world. And so this year, we focus our attention on a theme that responds, we hope, to all of that constant change, finding home in a changing world, which we symbolize with one word from among the 4 Mercy core values, and that word is hospitality. We've addressed the theme a number of times already this year, and the back of your program outlines some of those. Today, we embrace that theme of hospitality, finding home in a changing world, with this fall honors lecture on the hospitality of writing, delivered by 2 outstanding practitioners of the art. When I asked them to come, I wrote a letter to them, and I want to quote you just one long sentence in the letter, a couple of them. Quote, "The idea here is that in an age where young people are being encouraged by their modes of communication to use fewer and fewer words in more and more impersonal ways to communicate with each other, we do not want to lose sight of the essential gallantry that is inherent in good writing. We would like to host a lecture on the hospitality of writing, on how good writing can open up new worlds of ideas, of geography, of feelings," unquote. And we're so grateful that this husband and wife, 32 years married, accepted our invitation. Cindy Skrzycki is the 2012 recipient of the Ballot Teaching Award at the University of Pittsburgh, an annual award that only goes to 2 of their hundreds of faculty. She's been teaching there since 2004. She is still currently a correspondent for globalpost.com. She used to be a columnist for the Bloomberg News. She spent 18 years writing for the Washington Post, and she had a regular column there called The Regulators. Before she was at the Post, she was at U.S. News and World Report. She worked for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram out of Texas, for the Washington Bureau of the Fairchild News Service, and she was a business writer in her hometown for the Buffalo News. She's also the author of a book called The Regulators, The Anonymous Power Brokers Who Shape Your Life. Last year, she was among 15 women in the media, honored by the Women and Girls Foundation for, quote, leading the way in print, radio, PR, TV, film, and on the internet, and those using multiple medias to promote and amplify the voices of women and girls. Born in Buffalo, New York, she's the honors graduate of Aloysius College, and most importantly, she was the editor of the Griffin, which is their school paper. She has a master's degree from American University. She was a 2-term member of the board of directors. Her husband, David Shribman, is no stranger to this college. He was really the star of our panel last year on the university's role in civil discourse. We produced a monograph on that, which we've shared across the country, and it's gotten a lot of notice. David's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's currently the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He's had major editorial jobs at the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Washington Star. Those of you who watched This Week in Review on PBS, David was a regular panelist there for many years. He has a syndicated column, I think, for over 2 decades. He's written a number of books, edited a number of them as well. Interestingly, he serves on the selection committee for the annual Profiles in Courage Award, which is about courage in a political context. And like Cindy, he's got deep roots in higher ed. He's been a distinguished fellow at Virginia Commonwealth, a visiting fellow at Brandeis, the journalist in residence at Notre Dame, a scholar in residence at Gettysburg. He's a trustee emeritus of our alma mater, Dartmouth, and he's also the editor or author of at least 3 books on the college that we love so well. He's extremely highly regarded in his field. I want to close this introduction with the last paragraph from my letter to them, because I think it summarizes why we asked them to be here. Quote, we believe that you and your wife are almost uniquely qualified as a couple to speak to this topic, the hospitality of writing. David, because of your editorial work at the Post-Gazette and your superb handling of the Sunday editorial page in general, among many other responsibilities at the college. And Cindy, because of your experience and role now as a teacher of writing at a major university who's just won the award for teaching at your college. We're so happy that they accepted our invitation, and I want to welcome David now to the podium.
But to Natalie and Elizabeth, we're mom and dad, and we're hands in the neck. And we're the guys who asked them to clean their room and make their bed. We're delighted to be here. Thank you, President Foley. Thank you, Dean. The academic world and the press have always had a symbiotic relationship. Now, I just said symbiotic, I didn't say respectful. In 1890, Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard, which is a lesser college than Dartmouth, dismissed reporters as drunkards, deadbeats, and bummers. So, all of you drunkards, deadbeats, and bummers of the school paper and the literary magazine, I'm glad to salute you on this marvelous occasion, and thank you for inviting both of us. I salute you the way Samuel Johnson, my favorite writer, would have done so. In the Idler, which was a somewhat better paper than the Bell Tower, he wrote in 1758, "A news writer is a man without virtue who writes lies at home for his own profit. To these compositions is required neither genius nor knowledge, neither industry nor sprightliness, but contempt of shame, and indifference to the truth are absolutely necessary." So that's my theme for my talk tonight: genius and knowledge, industry and truth, hospitality and writing. Someone, H.L. Mencken it turns out, once said that journalism was a craft to be mastered in 4 days and abandoned at the first sign of a better job. It's taken me more than 30 years and I've yet to get a better job. But then again, Mencken thought the average newspaper, especially of the so-called better sort, maybe he had in mind one that describes himself as the one of America's great newspapers. Has the intelligence of a Baptist evangelist, the courage of a rat, the fairness of a prohibitionist, the information of a high school janitor, the taste of a designer of celluloid valentines, and the honor of a police station lawyer. He was right about that. In any case, it's not a bad way to earn a living, and in typing these remarks, I discovered that the words earn and learn are separated by only one letter, which is a happy thing for people like me. Now, as you know, our topic today is hospitality and writing, which ordinarily might seem to be two concepts with nothing to do with each other. Hospitality, after all, is a social noun, and it involves social practice and social behavior. Writing is a solitary act that in its purest form is a practice of independence. Only in news magazines and in calculus textbooks do you ever see much in the way of collaboration in writing, and you can hardly call either of them writing or acts of hospitality. But these words are not contradictory, and in the course of some minutes today, I hope to argue that they are in fact complementary. This may take a few moments and require some mental gymnastics, but we are, after all, in a former gym, and the exercise is worth the doing. So let's start, as we should here in a community of faith, a Catholic college tucked in these Pleasant Hills, with some remarks from the Catholic author and priest Henri J.M. Nouwen, whose works influenced me as a young man. He had a lot of interesting, incendiary, and provocative ideas about spirituality, and he had a very intriguing definition of hospitality. Hospitality, he wrote, means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. It is not to bring men and women over to your side, but to offer freedom, not disturbed by dividing lines. So let's examine that a bit. Good writing does exactly what Father Henri says it does. It creates free space where strangers can enter. It offers a chance to change. It doesn't bludgeon. H.L. Mencken accepted, of course. It welcomes. It offers the ultimate kind of freedom. The freedom to be moved by words, the freedom to think about words, the freedom to let words change our minds. What about the seeming incompatibility between social hospitality and solitary writing? I never thought about this very much until I was a young reporter and was given a wonderful assignment in 1981 to interview a fellow named William Manchester, who wrote several wonderful books, a 2-volume biography of Winston Churchill, the 3rd volume coming out only next month, a wonderful biography of MacArthur, and the greatest book, even today, about the terrible events and terrible sadness of November 1963, the death of the president. He and I were talking in the lobby of a hotel in Washington. I asked him about a particularly vivid and personal piece in his writing in his book. The book was his memoir as a Marine, and he said, "David, I wrote that book sitting alone in a room with the intention that it might be read by someone like you, sitting alone in a room." It's that communion between a man and a woman sitting alone in a room, talking directly over the ages, sometimes talking over the centuries, to someone else sitting alone in a room, that is the very richness of this experience. No form of thought is so deep, so deeply revolutionary as the written word. No act of hospitality is so meaningful. I jotted down just a few examples of the written word that might have the same effect. The Old Testament. I want to get a word in for the Old Testament here. Paradise Lost, in which God's ways are explained to man. Macbeth, The Rights of Man, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Das Kapital, Herbert Crowley's Promise of American Life, written about a century ago, in fact exactly a century ago. Mein Kampf, written in 1925, and which affects us to this day. The General Theory of Economics, by John Maynard Keynes. Profiles of Courage, by Senator John F. Kennedy. Writing is the key that unlocks not only the workplace, but the place of worship. Not only the ways to see the world and the ways to earn a living, but the ways to enhance the mind and the ways to live a life. For it was Sir Francis Bacon who said, "Reading maketh a full man, confidence a ready man, and writing an exact man." And while I provide kind of a cook's tour of great writing, in effect I've cited the Harvard classics in a speech by a Dartmouth man to a college run by a guy from the Yale Law School. B.F. Skinner was right when he put it this way: we shouldn't teach great books
We should just teach the love of reading. Now I want to talk for a moment about the other element mentioned in that remark I quoted by Samuel Johnson. That would be the truth. Because as Father Henri might have said, freedom and truth are brothers. Not so long ago, I pulled out of a file the famous cover of Time magazine. That was a magazine that people read in case for college students. I pulled out a file from the famous cover of Time magazine with a picture of Pope John II and the headline in red, John Paul, Superstar. Now it's a third of a century old now, and in its zeal to capture the rock star appeal of the new pontiff, it seems almost trivial and faintly disrespectful. Perhaps that is because we now know we could not have known then that before he would die, John Paul would be credited with ending the scourge of communism and carrying an uplifting and irresistible message of hope, peace, and love to people well beyond his flock and to nations that were once beyond the reach of Catholicism or even Christianity. But if John Paul was swiftly identifiable as a media star, then he also should be regarded as an astute student and a ferocious defender of freedom and of the truth and of the hospitality of spiritualism. This is of no trivial importance, particularly in an age of mass communications and nave-to-nave coverage. It's not because only the Pope understood the uses of the media, the way they could be shaped, harnessed, and directed. It's because the Pope understood the responsibility of the media as well, the way they should comport themselves, the way they should use their power, the way they should exert their moral authority. And more than any one of his time or ours, he understood the power of words. Now, it might be appropriate to pause for a moment of reflection on the words and images John Paul used to counsel those of us who work with words. They're deeply inspirational and they're deeply sobering. As a very young man, in fact, I had lived fewer years than John Paul would serve as Pope. I was given my favorite reporting assignment of all time, the chance to accompany the Pope on a 6-day trip to the United States. I mention this not to share an editor's sentimental memories, but to say that the words he said to those of us who accompanied him have been seared in my memory. I know them almost by heart. They're words to live by, and I can only say that I have tried. This is what he said. You are indeed servants of truth. You are its tireless transmitters, diffusers, and defenders. You are dedicated communicators, promoting unity among all nations by sharing truth among all peoples. Now, there's a lot of pompous talk in our culture about the truth, and I always cringe when I hear it, and wish yet when I talk that way myself. We have no more idea what the truth is than anyone else. We're not equipped with special powers, either legal or corporeal, and we have the same flaws as our critics, except almost always in greater doses. All we can do is to offer a fair representation of what we believe the truth is. The key here is fair, a word not unfamiliar to John Paul himself. For if you distill down most of what he said, beautiful though the rhetoric was, what he represented along with faith was fairness, another form of hospitality. Now, fairness is a gentle word, far grander than the ones used to assail or defend the media, but again, along with faith and truth, it may be the most powerful word on earth. This is the Pope again. Be faithful to the truth and to its transmission, for truth endures. Truth will not go away. Truth will not pass or change. And that's the Pope talking again about truth. But I believe what he really means here, along with the spiritual sense, is that truth ought to be applied to the work of being fair. We ought to be truthful to ourselves, to our readers, to the people we write about our motives, truthful about our methods, truthful above all about our limits. That's because truth is a goal that's perhaps unattainable. I've read more newspaper stories than almost anyone within eye's length of this podium. I've never read one that was fully the truth. There are stories in which every statement was true, to be sure. But truth is a question not only of what is included in a piece, but also what is omitted. There's no piece of writing long enough, broad enough, or smart enough that it does not tempt human frailty by being slightly incomplete or poorly focused. This is the Pope again. And I say to you, take it as my parting words to you, that in the service of truth, the service of humanity through the medium of the truth, is something worthy of your best years, your finest talents, your most dedicated efforts. That's the best we can do. We can serve truth. We cannot achieve it. We can enlist fairness in the service of truth. Sometimes that angers our readers, sometimes it angers the people and institutions we as a newspaper cover. But that's our job. That's our calling. In these days, we in our small corner of the culture can emulate the last pope in searching for truth, but we probably ought to emulate him in another way as well. We should remember what is perhaps the greatest irony, perhaps the greatest figure of our age, the sheer humility of the man. He never underestimated the size of his mission, but he never made himself greater than that mission. That, too, was an example of hospitality. That's where many of us who are writers have failed. We think we know the truth, and we do not. We have been so sure of the truths that we think we know we have sometimes forgotten to be fair. We're often not humble. A lot of this was easier to remember when, and it's part of my memory, if not of yours, when we were but scribblers on a page that soon would turn to dust. The technological revolution has changed all that, but it hasn't changed the potency of the Pope's words from 1979, the text of which was recorded by a typewriter. Being servants of the truth is worthy of our best years, our finest talents, and most dedicated efforts. It's the ultimate act of hospitality.
Good afternoon. As you can imagine, we talk about writing a lot in our house. I'm sure my children could tell you they've had quite enough of that over the years, writing and reading. Great priorities. You probably won't notice this, but I didn't really read David's talk before he gave it, but there's certain phrases in there that I repeat. So we either really believe this or we've been married too long. But anyway. Well, when I was thinking about the hospitality of writing and the word itself, hospitality, the idea of an invitation came to my mind. Can I bring a gift? Bring nothing but yourself. You've heard that before. Often when you get an invitation to a nice dinner and you're honored and you're excited to be asked, here the host is honoring you, extending exceptional hospitality by telling you to come and just bring yourself. No flowers, no wine, no gifts, just yourself. That's how encountering exceptional writing should make you feel. Like it was written for you, and you are having a special relationship with the author. Or conversely, you are doing the writing, and by doing it well, you are giving readers the ultimate invitation. Come with me and read what I have written for you. Writing may be a solitary pursuit, but every writer seeks readers and ultimately publication. In other words, the very intimate act of writing becomes a very public and welcoming one, whether it's a memoir, an account of a battle by a soldier on the field, a blog post by a new mother in a state of wonderment, or a scientist explaining why we need to understand the importance of the 3 pounds of bacteria we carry around in our brains, or it's a poem. Writing is a way of knowing, and when shared, it can be a remarkable gift. I now teach writing for a living, and I spent most of my career putting words on paper for large numbers of people to read. Through that act and my voice, they got to know me, what I thought about an issue, how I approached a story, what I was willing to put on paper, what kinds of responses I provoked in them. Any of you who are taking writing classes know that kind of writing, where readers can actually hear you. It's called voice. And it's an important thing to develop because it gives the audience an idea of what kind of welcome you are giving them. Some writers are exhibitionists, some are word engineers, critics, comedians, intellectuals, seers, and revisionists. As we get to know them and their voices, and we come to view them as friends, opponents, opportunists, mythical relatives, or even ourselves. When I select writings and readings for my classes at the University of Pittsburgh, I look for writers who will open up a part of the world that may have long passed, or one where there is so much pain that no one really goes there anymore, or where the words are so beautiful that students can't help but fall over the threshold into a subject they never considered reading about. Remarkably, sometimes this is sports. Let me share this passage with you written by John Updike about the baseball player Ted Williams. Williams is an icy star, but of all team sports, baseball, with its graceful intermittences of action, its immense and tranquil field sparsely settled with poised men in white, its dispassionate mathematics, seems to me best suited to accommodate and be ornamented by a loner. It is essentially a lonely game. Or this by Tom Boswell on Sugar Ray Leonard's bout with Roberto Duran in 1980. But boxing never changes. One central truth lies at its heart, and it never alters. Pain is the most powerful and tangible force in life. The threat of torture, for instance, is stronger than the threat of death. Execution can be faced, but pain is corrosive, like an acid eating at the personality. Pain is a priority. It may even be man's strongest and most undeniable reality. And that is why the fight game stirs us, even as it repels us. No matter if you know nothing about boxing and you don't much like baseball, this is writing that takes you into a new room where the writing goes to the essence of humanity, with sports as the avatar. Only good writing can welcome you into a world you don't care about, or one you think you already know, but don't. It should leave you surprised. Writers think about the process of writing a lot, and some have very secretive, stealth ways of approaching the page. Again, it's a solitary pursuit that takes discipline and the practice of an athlete. But all of it involves thinking, and most of all, discovering what you think. The magic is that you capture thoughts and arrange them in a way that happens only once. The author Peter Taylor, who wrote The Old Forest and Other Stories, and one of my favorite authors, said, "Writing is how you discover what you think." Take Martha Gellhorn. It wasn't until she encountered war as a young journalist in 1937, she saw a battlefield and the bloody limbs of small children, that she came to know what she thought about war and peace. In a piece called High Explosive for Everyone, she wrote, she was in Spain, "A small twisted piece of steel, hot and very sharp, sprays off from the shell. It takes the little boy in the throat. The old woman stands there, holding the hand of the dead child, looking at him stupidly, not saying anything, and men run out here to carry the child. At their left, at the side of the square, is a huge brilliant sign which says, 'Get out of Madrid.'" Writing is a way of understanding our flaws, of changing our minds, of inviting others to change our minds for us, of allowing us to identify with the worst and the best of mankind. One of the periods in our history where writing became essential to understanding ourselves was the Civil Rights era. Though television is credited with capturing the hatred of Bull Connor, the sour racism of the Birmingham bombers, and the stubbornness of Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, some of the most stark portrayals of racism came from reporters who witnessed the hiss of the crowd when in 1957 the Little Rock Nine tried to integrate the city's public school. And I'm sure you all know about this episode. Or when they were at the Pettus Bridge in Alabama, when Roy Reid of the New York Times used his pen as a camera to capture this scene. Quote, "The next sound was the major's voice. 'Troopers, advance,' he commanded. The troopers rushed forward, their blue uniforms and white helmets blurring into a flying wedge as they moved. The wedge moved with such force that it seemed to pass over the waiting column instead of through it. The first 10 or 20 Negroes were swept to the ground screaming. arms and legs flying, and packs and bags skittering across the grassy divider strip and onto the pavement on both sides. The mounted posse men spurred their horses and rode at a run into the retreating mass. The Negroes cried out as they crowded together for protection, and the whites on the sidelines whooped and cheered. I don't think you could do that better with a camera. Or the 1960s, when writers like Joan Didion took readers to San Francisco to get a sense of the confused runaways who went to Haight Street, where missing children were gathering and calling themselves hippies. As America struggled with deep fissures in its social order, Didion wrote this unforgettable opening to her story, Slouching Toward Bethlehem. The center was not holding. It was a country of bankruptcy notices and public auction announcements and commonplace reports of casual killings and misplaced children and abandoned homes and vandals who misspelled the four-letter words they scrawled. It was a country in which families routinely disappeared, trailing bad checks and repossession papers. It was not a country in open revolution. It was not a country under enemy siege. It was the United States of America in the cold, late spring of 1967. Kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? And I cannot leave out Theodore White, who wrote The Making of the President in 1960, where he used a slow cadence writing to show us for the first time the private life of a presidential candidate, a template that has been used in succeeding campaigns by other authors with differing degrees of success. One of my favorite characterizations of the Kennedy-Nixon race is this. For John F. Kennedy, round one began in euphoria, sagged swiftly almost to despair, then rose to a point of cautious hope. Kennedy had flown directly from Los Angeles in the convention to Cape Cod and Hyannisport. There the sun shone through milk blue skies, and as the breeze whipped whitecaps off Nantucket Sound as it scrubbed the dunes clean. Home again with wife and child, Jackie and brother Bobby and the Marlin, the candidate could let his nerve fibers mend. Within the compound, the candidate and his brother Robert wandered back and forth across the lawn to each other's homes or lounged, stripped to the waist, on beach chairs in the sun, and slowly began to talk politics again. Wouldn't we be grateful to have that kind of grace note in this election? The value of a liberal arts education is in learning to think, to let yourself open doors. Reading and writing are the essential bulwarks of liberal arts, and they provide the necessary exercises for learning how to think in both subtle and grandiose ways. I tell my students writing is hard. It is a discipline. Writing can be addictive. Writing can lead to despair. There's nothing scarier than an empty page. It calls for empathy, a keen ear, a musical voice, a sharp eye, and most of all, a mind that notices everything and then can shift those images to words. The process of writing requires just bringing yourself. No fancy computer programs, no tweets, no personal web pages. Whatever the technological advances or thoughts that the electronic world allows everyone to think they are a writer, there still are constants. William Zinsner, in the 30th anniversary edition of his oft-assigned book on writing well, sends this admonishment to us. I don't know what still newer marvels will make writing twice as easy in the next 30 years, but I do know they won't make writing twice as good. That will still require plain old hard thinking and the plain old tools of the English language. In the true spirit of hospitality, I welcome you to pull up a chair and write as much as you can and read even more. It may be the one true path to experiencing the best of a liberal arts education, learning how to think. Thank you.
He just told his wife that was marvelous. It was marvelous. Both so many profound sentences in your remarks. I just want to grab a couple of them. David, you started off with the notion that hospitality and writing are complementary, and then you proved it. And interestingly, I saw Sister Helen Marie nodding when you quoted Father Nguyen, because we have talked about the other context of hospitality, and you really caught it exactly. The image that you created for us of the book about a military experience, of one person sitting alone in a room writing that book, meeting David years later and saying, I always hoped, and I wrote that book for one other person sitting alone in a room reading it, was really quite profound. And of course, the references to a great writer, Pope John Paul, and his notion of writers as servants of truth can't be repeated enough. Cindy, you started off with a wonderful passage about the real connection between hospitality and writing when you said that writing is a way of knowing, and when shared, it's a remarkable gift. And that's the ultimate hospitality. And thank you for that definition. You also created a great image of how you encourage your students to read and to write, because as you put it, it opens up a part of the world that sometimes is long past, and it's the only way to get to it again. You said writing is how we discover what we think. Sometimes it's a way of understanding our own flaws, and isn't that the truth? And you said towards the very end that writing is hard, it's addictive, it can lead to despair, but it's important to write as much as you can and to read even more. I loved the sports analogies. I knew the Ted Williams lines from John Updike. There's almost nothing he wrote that isn't incredibly profound, but you reminded me of Red Smith, one of the great sports writers of all time, who wrote that there's nothing to writing. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and open up a vein. And he was saying that about writing about sports. So there is so much about writing that goes to hospitality in so many different ways. Let me just stop there and open up for questions, conversation from our audience. Dr. Costanza.
Hi, yes, my name is Jessica Costanza. I'm on the English faculty here, so thank you very much to both of you. I of course appreciate the subject matter. I'm also the brand new advisor to the Bell Tower for student paper. So I actually have a question, Cindy, for you specifically. I was just wondering if you could speak to our writers and editors, I know there's a few in the audience here, about your experience as editor of Britain. And I'll have to go back a little bit there. But I was hoping you could also answer the question, how can our student journalists contribute thoughtfully and hospitably to a student publication? So, thank you.
Well, the first experience was a long time ago, but I have to say it did mark me for life. I was also editor of my high school newspaper. So obviously I knew what I wanted to do. And that is one of the great things about working for a student newspaper. There's really no other experience that prepares you quite as well for what might come later in your life. Because you are forced for the first time to meet a very strict deadline, to write coherently, to motivate your fellow students, peers, to write and meet deadlines as well, which, as many of you probably know, that's the hardest part of the job. Peer-to-peer management is really tough. And I had a great cohort of people on our student newspaper, and actually David talks about this a lot, how you get these sort of strange cohorts that click and produce people who go on to be professionals in an area when you never thought that could happen. I mean, I became a professional journalist. My sports editor became a sports reporter at USA Today. Another person on the staff became a professional journalist as well. And I went to a very tiny college in Buffalo, New York, Aloysius College, run by the Jesuits, and it's remarkable to turn out 3 professional journalists. So there's always a lot of possibility on a student newspaper. As to your second question, how can you be effective in your writing and hospitable? Well, this again goes to fairness and truth. And I actually work a lot with the student newspaper at Pitt. In fact, I teach a class called the Pitt News. And it's for students who are on the paper or who want to be on the student paper, where they get enough preparation that they can join the staff and start writing. And the thing that we talk about a lot is fairness, accuracy, how deeply you're willing to commit yourself to journalism. Because this is something that you are going to share with your whole community. It has a public face. It's not like writing for class, where you get this intimate relationship with your professor. Again, you're writing for your peers, you're writing for your betters as well. So it's very important to be careful and thorough and mindful of what you're writing. And what does this require? It requires hard work. It requires research. It requires reporting. It requires great accuracy. And those are the things we talk about all the time. And I see always, even in the most experienced students who might be seniors and have been on the paper for years, I see great growth even in the space of a term when students are really taught to focus on these things, rather than just assume whatever I write goes in the paper.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Claudia. Just a general question, since you and your husband are both into ministry and training, 2 daughters, what experience did they pursue growing up in the house?
First of all, they grew up in the most boring home in Western Pennsylvania. They thought they had the coolest parents. They did. We forced them to read good books. Cindy went to the library every Friday and brought back huge masses of books. Kids hated her. We have one daughter who is the assistant artistic director of the 10th Philharmonic Orchestra. She graduated from Dartmouth College. Another daughter who is a junior at Bates College, and being the product of a Catholic mother with a Jewish father, may become a rabbi. And she'd be happy probably never to read another book for the rest of her life, and her sister probably agrees.
No, I don't Natalie is a religious studies major at Bates.
The best major of all.
The best major of all. And I was delighted that she picked that major because it is so broad and it opens so many doors, and she has to understand so many cultures that I think it's just one of the best liberal arts majors you can pick. My other daughter was a music major, and that's opens many doorways as well.
And we were so cruel as parents. We didn't allow them to watch television. We didn't allow them to drink soda pop. And I overheard one kid once say to another one, or I would say, how do the parents even punish them? Let them take away.
Right. Right.
I'm telling you guys, the best gift you can give yourself is to read.
Absolutely. And every conversation, this gets really tiresome, I'm sure, for my younger daughter. I always say, what are you reading, Natalie? What are you reading?
It's the first question I asked job applicants. And when I had an applicant, I tell you this is the absolute truth, be book editor of the Post-Gazette, and she said she hadn't read anything this year. She didn't get the whole job.
Sister Alvarez.
Especially, David, you mentioned a lot about truth in that sense that that's the truth and fairness are the qualities of the writer to keep in mind. But I think we're living in an era where there isn't a lot of meaning to the word truth. So how do you speak of it in a way that would create?
Let me repeat the question. What do you do about this truth business in an era when there's not much? Well, there still are truths, we just don't say it. I mean, I think, you teach lots of truths here at President Foley's College, your college, actually. I'm sure in the faculty meeting you feel you own the college. That there are truths to be taught. One of the truths to be taught is that we can't fully know the truth. One of the truths to be taught is that in an era of contention and an era of lies, that truths are more important than ever. We're seeing a horrifying presidential election in which neither man tells the truth about the other. They're both really remarkable men of achievement, and they ought to be ashamed of the way they're running their campaigns. And that's a truth I think we all, it's a truth that's evident to us all. So I think the truths endure, and they're even more precious in an era like our own. And one of the great truths is that the search for truth goes on. And the other great truth is that none of us can know the truth.
I have a question concerning one aspect of reading that I've noticed over the years is that some of the best books are ones that you can come back to over the decades, and you see something different each time. And I know from my perspective, the books that I read when I was a teenager, some of them now, I can't even get to them. Others I'm reading from a much different perspective, and I appreciate them in new and different ways. And I was wondering if you could share perhaps some of the works across your life that have spoken to you differently across life.
Well, there's one book I can't talk about, and I love her as a writer, and she's on her 4th book, and that's Lois Lowry. And I've read a lot of books with my children, obviously, as an incentive to get them to read.
Another reason they hate us.
You know, there are some very lovely, I love The Giver. I love the whole idea of creating this dystopian but positive world. And now that Lois Lowry has come out with her 4th book, I want to sit down and read them all. Again. You know, it's things like that you go back to and see in a very, very different way. I mentioned Peter Taylor. He's another writer. He's a Southern writer. He wrote short stories. You know, you go back and you read those. It's not like modern writing. It's beautiful. It's textured. And it's very easy, you know, to read. But every time I read him, I think, wow, what a wise man. I didn't even notice this the first time. And I am one of those people who likes to read J.D. Salinger over and over again, just because I like that kind of writing. And reading J.D. Salinger as an adult versus a student is a whole different thing. So those are 3 examples, you know, of books that I would go back to and read again. And I go back to many books and read them again as I assign them in classes. And I had mentioned in my talk this element of surprise. There'll be something that I'll see in a passage or that I may have overlooked once that I'll go back to and say, wow, this is unbelievable. And it might be a piece on civil rights, or it might be a speech or something like that just, as you get older, hits you in a very different way because you bring experience to the reading.
I wish I reread things more often. I wouldn't count rereading several times the Red Sox reader as a great act of charity and brilliance. But I've read The Making of the President in 1960 about 5 times. It feeds my obsession about the 1960 election. You'll see a theme here. I've read President Kennedy's inaugural address about 80 times. Last night I started to reread Profiles of Courage because I was looking for something in it, and I think it's a marvelous book. But I'll list a bunch of things I wish I had the time to reread it. I wish Cindy introduced me to Anna Karenina. I love that book. I'd like to reread that sometime I have an extra month, or when I'm nothing to do for a month, I can read that again. I'd like words of Nathaniel Hawthorne quite often. I was born in Salem, Massachusetts. They speak to me directly. I'd like to reread a lot of Dickens. I'd like to read, I have about 40 books in a pile that's taken over my office and stuff I haven't read yet that I want to read. So, I mean, after I get fired, I'll be having plenty to do.
You just prompted me, David, on that. That's a great question, by the way. Thanks for asking that. It's got all of us thinking, you know, what we like. I come back actually to collections of shorter things. Updike has a collection called Hugging the Shore, which is fabulous. You can pick it up and reread any part of it at any time. I remember reading Flannery O'Connor in high school, who, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read her, she's a Southern writer. She wrote a lot of short stories. And really compelling. Yeah, it's just great writing, the real stories. And then when I thought of Flannery O'Connor, there was an Irish short story writer named Frank O'Connor, who pretty much only wrote that genre. You can reread them all the time because, again, they are stories, but there is a much larger theme in every one of them that dances through it. And as you indicated, as you get older and you read them again, you understand them in ways that are a little bit different.
You know, I read not long ago, Alistair, somebody's, McLeod, I think, a book called Island, about King Ferdinand. And I read about 300 pages, and I read about 270 before I realized I read it already. And reminds me of a story I'll tell in a second. And it's because what I saw in the second reading was so different from what I saw in the first. I've been taking piano lessons for about 35 years, and the piano teacher came over to the house one night and played a piece. And he said, David, you know, maybe you should play that piece someday. And I said, I've been playing it the last week. Because when something is done by a master rather than by an idiot, it's so much different. And when you read a book as an adult, after having read it as a child,
Yes, Joan?
Do you feel the impact of technology is positive or negative in writing or reading skills?
Let's repeat that question. Do you feel the impact of technology is a positive or a negative in writing? And specifically maybe on the hospitality front?
Well, I teach most of my classes where I really don't allow computers to be open or phones, just because I feel that students need to cleanse themselves of that sort of moment-to-moment bother of having very fragmentary messages being shot at them all the time, which I think definitely changes how we think and how our brain works, and not necessarily in a positive way. And I think we all have experienced this. I find that if I don't turn my computer on at work, I can get far more work done. I can think more deeply, I can keep focused better. I think I see it in students' writing, where writing has become more fragmentary, less grammatical, and less narrative. So I spend a lot of time talking about narration in writing, where sentences need to be coherent to tell a story, and they need to flow, and they need to have voice. And I think this is something that's getting lost because everything is so choppy. You know, if you watch TV and there's a ticker tape running all the time, you know, your brain is ping-ponging around the room. It really does take solitude and focus to read well and to write well. And I think this is something that is getting lost. I don't think it's the same, and I'm sure I sound like a troglodyte for this, to read a book electronically versus sitting down with the book and cradling it. Actually having this object that you hold close to you, and it has a smell, right? It has a feel. And you show it some respect. It's an individual thing. There's only that one book on that one thing. It doesn't disappear off a screen or get stored on a server. It's yours, it's on your shelf, or it belongs to the library, or whatever. It has almost a personality. So yes, I think technology is fine in the sense that people say, well, it doesn't matter what platform writing is on and all that sort of thing. Well, I think it allows us to write much faster and much more precisely, particularly for people who are journalists. I mean, in the old days, David and I met, it was a remarkable thing that any writing got done at all. Really, the patience it took. You sat at a typewriter, and I'm talking about a typewriter with keys that went boom, boom, boom. And if you made a mistake in your story, you know, that was going to go in the newspaper, you had to cut that section out with scissors. So you would remove that section, retype a new section, take some glue from a glue pot, which were common things in newsrooms, and got thrown at people when editors got angry at reporters. You know, you'd see these glue pots sailing through the air. And you would have to take your new written paragraph, typed paragraph, and glue it in. So heaven knows you didn't want to make too many mistakes because you'd never make your deadline, right? You wouldn't last long in that profession. So we either wrote worse because we changed less, or we were brilliant to begin with and didn't make mistakes. I don't know which, but we often look back at early stories that we wrote at a much younger stage and said, "Boy, these are awful."
Let me just say that I think electronics has been both a blessing and a curse on me. That as a result, I think many of you students have almost no common knowledge and no common knowledge of things that we think are common, like presidents and whether the War of 1812 came before the Civil War. And all sorts of things like that. But I would also say that writing, it's possible to be an incomparably better writer because of technology than it ever was before, for the reasons Cindy talked about. Now, you just think about this. You sit and you write a whole page of copy, okay? And then you screw up something in the last paragraph. You got to pull the whole thing out. And if you're writing for academics, you're not going to use Cindy's glue pot. You get the whole thing out and retype it, and then fix the bottom of the paragraph. You're probably going to say, forget it, good enough, go on. But now, you don't have to do that. You can just hit the delete button or the back button, and you can fix it up. You can experiment with what you're going to write without any cost to you in paper, time, or inconvenience.
Or pride.
Or pride. And so, I think you can do the ordinary writer can be a better writer. We're ordinary writers. We're not artists here. You know, what we do here is under somebody's cat tomorrow, you know, or soon. And so, for the ordinary writer, these tools are the opposite of what the catcher's outfit is, the tools of ignorance. These are the tools that allow you to soar. And I think we should be really grateful for the computer for that reason. We can be much better writers, take more chances, try things out that we would never do with paper, ever. So I think we're much better writers.
We can actually, it's a great question, John. We could spend an hour just getting you guys' opinions on that. Are you a better writer? Is it easier to write? We certainly have a lot more writing in one sense because of technology. Blogs didn't exist when we were your age. We didn't have that capacity to communicate so intimately and personally as you guys do, much more than we ever did.
But we wrote letters.
We wrote letters. We wrote letters. Just two quick points. The early description, which predates the lives of just about everyone in the room after the first 3 rows here, of what writing was. I mean, it's hard for you guys to imagine this, but David and I are the favorite political person that we both worked for one, a guy named Jim Shannon. I had a Yale Law degree. I did lots of sort of big thinking for Jim, but I also responded to every constituent letter on a foreign policy issue, because that was my area. And I sat there with a typewriter, and I had to type 25 letters a day. And it was just like Cindy said, God forbid if you made a mistake.
You see, all these students know what I know, the minute you tell them.
As soon as I start talking.
Let me just add one more from our shared past. Two elements. One is, I think President Foley, if we were blindfolded, both of us, and twirled around so we were disoriented, and then dropped on the full floor of the stacks of Baker Library, and the only sensory perception we had was our nose, we would be able to say with certainty that we were in Baker Library. And I would say there are other things. We were in college at a time where you could make $1 by typing somebody else's paper, because most people didn't know how to type. And if you knew how to type, you could earn a lot of money on the first floor Butterfield Hall by typing somebody else's paper. Now, that particular way of earning your way through college has disappeared.
One last thing on this particular dialogue. There's a point of science here, and Michelle's all the way in the back there reminds me of this all the time. And this goes back to your point, Cindy, about what is happening when you're constantly interrupted. Those of you who are juniors heard me give an hour lecture on this one time. It really is true that your synapses, which is how you form ideas in your brain, do not happen as well or as quickly when you're allowing yourself to be interrupted by all kinds of other mediums. Some of you may remember I put up a slide that had a young person your age hooked up to 7 different communication devices while they were asleep. And what really happens is when you interrupt yourself, that synapse in your brain, the formation of a number of nerve endings, it gets interrupted and you don't get as deep, which is the word that Cindy used, which is why sometimes being alone, when you're writing and when you're reading is really important. And that means alone in the sense that you don't have a lot of other things happening. You don't have technology happening to you. And if you think nothing else from this hour conversation that we've had, I hope that you remember that some time being alone is essential to learning who you are, to figuring out how to write, and to really get to the next level. Let's take maybe one more question. No, go ahead.
I have one thing to
Yeah.
add. One thing that really helps with writing, I had mentioned very briefly that you have to view it the way athletes view their specialty. They do it every day. They practice every day. They don't practice once in a while. They, whatever it is they need to work on, they work on. And there's many books on writing and the process of writing. And many of them, most of them say that you need to go to the same place every day to write. That there is something about having a place to write, a quiet place to write, that will make you more successful at your craft.
And Cindy's saying that as someone who spent her life writing in a noisy place.
Right. Right. I sat in the Washington Post newsroom, which is an extremely, extremely noisy place. So there you learn the discipline of completely shutting out everything that's going on around you. But you are sitting at your desk. In that same, I had a corner desk every day at the same time, pretty much. And there's something about that feeds the neurons that make writing happen, that start the process. And it's even things that seem as inconsequential as time, what time of the day it is, right? Remember I said that there's all these like stealthy things that writers do to get going? I was trained to start writing after 3 o'clock because I spent the whole day out reporting, right? But by the time you come back at 3 or 4 o'clock, you have to have a story in at 6 or 7. That's when your brain clicks into the writing mode, and you sit down in that place and you surround yourself, you put your blinders on, and you start writing. And to this day, I have to say, even though I don't have to do that, my most productive time of the day is between 3 and 6, which is why I always get home late for dinner.
Right, which is why the meals at our house are so big, because I make them. But let me just add, I'm somebody who wrote most of my life on an airplane, and who wrote a piece last week during the Steelers game.
But when I want to write a piece that really matters to me, something that really matters to me, I get out a yellow legal pad and a pen, because you can't write very fast with that. And I find that if something that really has to have some meaning and depth, that the exercise of writing it out in longhand, which I can't do at work, and changes the pace of how I think and how I write. Another thing I do sometimes is I think of a song. This sounds really stupid. A song that matches the mood I want to create, and I hum it to myself as I write, so that the words have that rhythm. Now think of, those of you old enough to think, and this goes back to the Kennedy obsession again, but this is after college of my Irish Catholic. Think of the song Camelot, and think of how you might write if you had that song, that soundtrack going through your mind. This is how you might write if you had Led Zeppelin going through your mind, or somebody else. And I think to set the soundtrack of your writing, to actually have the soundtrack in your mind makes a difference.
Let's take one more question and then I'll just finish with the closing thought. John.
As an opinion columnist myself, I do the right things for the bell tower. I often find that I get swept away on great waves of feeling. And before I know, I've written 2,000 words, which were very strongly worded. What advice would you have for tempering a very strong emotion in an opinion with hospitality?
Are you writing editorials, or are you an opinions columnist?
Mostly editorials.
Mostly editorials. Well, this is where fairness really comes in, right? And actually, I would say I wouldn't write a thing until I did a lot of research. Again, I go back to my experience with my own students who write editorials for the Pitt News. And I say, don't pass judgment on things that other people have written. Go find out for yourself. In other words, they'll write commentary on something maybe that was in the Post-Gazette or something that happened. I say, why don't you go out and find out for yourself what you think? But before you come back and start throwing bombs, you need to really think about what you learned. And a really good thing to do when you're writing opinion pieces is to do some reporting, to actually talk to people, because they might change your mind. Particularly at this stage in your life, when you're really young, right? You don't have the benefit of a lot of experience. I tell students to go report everything. And even if you don't use a quote, it's going to inform what you think. And you may come to a wholly different conclusion that isn't quite as incendiary.
Now that I don't write Deadline anymore, I don't only write basically columns and book reviews. I have a rule, is that I write something and I never send it in until the next day. That's a luxury you didn't have as a book correspondent. But right now, I always, even if an editor wants it back soon, I always say I'll send it in, because I like to read it fresh again. And I'm reminded of something, I don't know you and I don't know anything but what your passion is, but you seem to have some views of a passion. I'm reminded of, and how old are you?
21.
21. I'm reminded what a very wise man, William Carter, who was the president of Colby College about 30 years ago, once said, when all these students would run into his office and say, President Carter, I'm going to take a year off to find myself. And he would say, why would you do that? There are so many more interesting things to find. And so I wouldn't be swept up in having opinions on things quite so young. I'd really be swept up in finding out about things. And of course I'm wrong in some ways, because the passion of the young has fueled what? Fueled the Russian Revolution. It fueled the American Revolution. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. We can think of Zuckerberg was 19 when he thought up Facebook. Wish he hadn't, but he did. So much of what I'm saying is utterly wrong. generally I think it's better not to force yourself to have opinions and passions. And I will quote Robert Frost's class of 1901 in Dartmouth, who said, "I never dared be radical when young, for fear I'd be conservative when old."
And I'll add one other thing. One way to really check yourself is to take your piece and read it out loud.
Absolutely.
Read it out loud in a room where there isn't anyone else. Read it to yourself. How does it strike you?
And if you sound like an ass,
Kill it. Kill it immediately. Because there's
That's probably
two,
happened before. It's-
right, there's two kinds of passion, right? There's passion for writing, and there's passion for righteousness, and writing about issues that people need to know about, but are right. And there's passion that can be very hurtful and inhospitable. So in this act of writing and reading it to yourself, you'll know.
John, there's a great line that's consistent with what both of our guests have said. James Mistry used to say, "I'm not really a very good writer, but I'm an excellent rewriter." And that applies, wholly to the business of journalism. Let me just invite our guests to perhaps some, whatever closing thoughts they might have.
Well, I want to thank you for having us here. I hope all of you spend some time not only thinking about writing, but actually writing, because it's a very, very powerful tool. And when I look back on my own career, I don't regret a moment of it, because as I always say to my students, journalism, which is talking to people and writing, it's not a career, it's a vocation. And the most wonderful thing about it is that it's never the same. No day is the same, and it's really the only thing I can think of, besides writing books, is where you learn something every day. I think that's magical, actually. And you couldn't live your working life any better than that.
I couldn't add, as usual, I have nothing to add.
One, really want to thank you for beginning with the words from Father Nguyen about, and we've been preaching that all year, that it's really about creating space, not about making judgments, but about creating space so that people can be. And that's a very important element of writing, and that you began with that. The second thank you is the thank you to both of you for doing what David described with good writing, which is getting out his legal pad, really taking time and writing slowly. Your prepared remarks, Cindy and David, were both very careful, very experienced, very thoughtful, and very heartfelt. And we appreciate that you put that time in them before you came up to our college, Mount Aloysius. And then lastly, a couple of our students from the newspaper want to thank you with a little